SEAL commander shoved her at briefing. Froze when she flashed classified Omega clearance. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in March of 1987, and it said nothing about her clearance. That was the first problem. Colonel Raymond Ashford had run the Special Operations Briefing Room at Fort Bragg, North Carolina, for 11 years. He ran it the same way every time. Visitors checked in with the duty sergeant at the outer desk. Visitors waited in the hallway until called. Visitors did not walk through the steel door unescorted. Those were the rules. They had always been the rules. He was midway through a pre-mission review when the door opened. She walked in carrying a manila folder and a brown leather satchel worn at the corners. No uniform, dark blazer, gray slacks, flat shoes, brown hair pulled back. She looked approximately 40, though it was hard to say with certainty. She did not knock. She did not wait to be acknowledged. She pulled out the chair at the back of the room and sat down. Ashford stopped talking. He was 6'2" and had run SEAL Team 6 selection for 3 years before taking the briefing command. He was not accustomed to being interrupted. Not by civilians. Not by women who looked like mid-level department administrators from some agency no one had ever heard of. He told her the room was restricted. She nodded, opened the manila folder, started reading. Ashford put down his pointer and walked to the back of the room. His operations sergeant, Petty Officer Dean Merritt, was already on his feet by the door. 2 of the mission planners had turned around in their chairs. The room had the particular stillness of men who have learned to read a commanding officer's posture and know when to be quiet. Ashford reached the back row and told her again. She looked up from the folder, reached into the left breast pocket of her blazer, placed a laminated card on the table in front of him. He looked at it for a long moment. Then he sat down. Her name was Margaret Elspeth Crane. She had grown up on a working farm outside Fredericksburg, Virginia, the third of 4 children born to James and Ruth Crane, who raised soybeans and cattle on 320 acres of Stafford County land that had been in the family since 1903. She had attended Mary Washington College on an academic scholarship, graduated in 1968 with a degree in mathematics, and accepted a position 3 weeks later with an organization whose name did not appear in any publicly available government directory. She had been there 19 years. In those 19 years, Margaret Crane had worked in 7 countries on 4 continents. She had worked the Cold War signals desk in Berlin in 1972, when the analysts in Washington had not yet understood what they were reading. She had spent 8 months in Beirut in 1983, 2 of those months after the embassy bombing, when most of the station had been withdrawn and the remaining personnel operated from a 3-room apartment in the Hamra district. She had recruited 11 foreign intelligence assets, all of whom remained active as of the morning she walked into Ashford's briefing room. She was a GS-15, Step 10, with a base salary of $82,000 annually. She held classified Omega clearance, issued in September of 1979 by a committee whose composition remained classified. There were, at that time, fewer than 40 people in the United States government who held that designation. Ashford was not one of them. The card on the table was 3.25 inches wide and 2.125 inches tall. Standard laminate, slightly thicker than a driver's license. The designation printed on it was not a color most people in that room had ever seen on a clearance card. The serial number ran 17 characters. The issuing authority line contained an abbreviation Ashford recognized, but had never seen on physical documentation. He picked it up, turned it over, set it back down. He asked Merritt to clear the room. Merritt started to object. Ashford repeated it. The mission planners filed out. Merritt was last. He pulled the steel doors shut behind him. The latch clicked. Ashford and Crane were alone. He asked her why she was there. She told him she needed to know the exact coordinates of the pre-insertion staging point for the operation scheduled for the following Thursday. She told him she needed the projected radio window schedule, and she needed the name of the local asset the team was planning to contact on the ground. He told her that was not information he could share outside the operation chain. She told him his operation chain had a penetration problem. There had been 4 operations over the preceding 18 months that had failed to reach their objectives. 3 in the Middle East. 1 in Southeast Asia. All 4 had been planned in that same briefing room. All 4 had used assets drawn from the same pool of local contacts. All 4 had involved advanced coordination with liaison offices in the host countries. All 4 had gone wrong in the first 8 hours. The standard post-operation review process had examined equipment failure. It had examined communication protocols. It had examined route planning. It had not examined the liaison contacts, because examining the liaison contacts required clearance that the reviewing officers did not hold. Crane had been examining them for 6 months. She had a legal pad in the leather satchel. 14 pages of handwritten notes, small and precise. The numbers and dates aligned in columns even without graph paper. She laid it on the table between them. She did not narrate it. She let him read. He read for 11 minutes. Then he asked her one question. She answered it. He did not speak again for another 40 seconds. What she had found was not a dramatic breach. It was not a turned officer or a compromised database. It was something smaller and in some ways harder to see. It was a pattern. A pattern of information that had moved through legitimate channels at the wrong speed, not too slow, too fast. Information that had traveled from the briefing room to the liaison offices in 18 hours or less, when the formal transmission protocols required between 48 and 72 hours. Somebody was making informal contact. Somebody in the coordination chain. Not necessarily with hostile intent, possibly out of a desire to appear efficient or to maintain a relationship, or simply out of habit formed over years of close collaboration. Possibly out of something else entirely. Crane could not yet say which. That was why she needed the coordinates, the radio window, and the asset name. She needed to introduce a specific variation into the Thursday operation and watch where it surfaced. Ashford asked if she had authorization from his commanding general. She said no. He asked why not. She said because his commanding general's office was part of the coordination chain. He sat with that for a while. The room was 24 feet by 18 feet. Drop ceiling. Fluorescent lights, one of them flickering slightly at the left rear corner. The wall maps were covered with felt curtains in the absence of cleared personnel. The table was gray steel, government surplus, the kind bought in bulk and distributed without consideration for the rooms they ended up in. Ashford had put a coffee ring on one corner of it sometime in 1985, and it had been there ever since. He was 47 years old. He had spent 24 years in the Navy, the last 9 of them in special operations. He had run missions in places that did not appear in official mission logs and participated in actions that would not be declassified in his lifetime. He was not easily surprised. He was surprised now. He asked her what she needed from him specifically. She told him. She needed access to the briefing for Thursday's operation as a silent observer with no notated presence in the attendance record. She needed him to adjust the coordinates by exactly 800 meters northeast of the actual insertion point when communicating with the liaison contact. She needed the radio window transmitted through the usual channel, but shifted by 4 hours from the actual schedule. She needed the asset contact name to remain accurate. 1 true thing, 2 false things. A specific pattern, she would watch where the corrections surfaced. Ashford asked how long she had been tracking the chain. 6 months, she told him. He asked if she had done this before. She had. He asked what had happened. She said the first time she had recovered a penetrated network without the penetration becoming aware it had been identified. The second time, the penetration had become aware, and 2 people had been hurt because of it. She told him this, without elaboration. Just the fact, stated plainly. And then the silence that followed it. He asked her how she had ended up in that room on that particular morning. She said she had been in the hallway for about 20 minutes waiting for the duty sergeant to admit her through normal channels. The duty sergeant had told her 3 times that the room was restricted and that she needed to leave her credentials with him and wait for authorization. She had decided that waiting was no longer optimal and let herself in. Ashford said he understood. He was quiet again. Long enough that the fluorescent light at the back corner finished its cycle and steadied itself. Then he told her she could observe Thursday's briefing. Thursday arrived cold and overcast. Fort Bragg in March held on to winter longer than the calendar suggested it should. The ground was frozen an inch deep in the pre-dawn hours when the vehicles moved through the east gate. Inside the briefing room it was 68 degrees, the thermostat maintained by a building HVAC system that had not been serviced in 14 months. Crane sat at the back left corner of the room, to the right of the door, in a chair pulled from the hallway by Merritt, without comment. She had a yellow legal pad. She did not use it. Ashford delivered the adjusted coordinates at 06:30 in the 4th minute of the briefing. He said them clearly. He did not mark the pause in his delivery. He had written them on the map board that morning. The false position 800 meters northeast, the letters and numbers precise and unambiguous. He gave the radio window 4 hours later than the actual schedule at 0644. He gave the asset name accurately. Crane wrote one thing on the legal pad at 0643. Then she put the pen down. The briefing ended at 0742. The first response surfaced 31 hours later. A liaison contact in the receiving office had sent a standard coordination cable. The cable contained a reference to the insertion point, embedded in a logistical request for ground transport arrangement. The coordinates in the cable matched the false set Ashford had provided, not the actual position, not a coincidence, not a reformulation. The exact figures, written in a cable that should not have contained them, transmitted through a channel that had a 6-hour lag on logging. Crane had intercepted a copy through her own channel, which did not intersect with any of the 4 compromised operations communication pathways. She had what she needed. The subsequent process took 11 weeks. It was not a dramatic investigation in the way that word suggests. There were no confrontations, no arrests conducted in hallways or offices. The work was done quietly, through the kind of patience that people who spent years in foreign stations learned, because the alternative was noise, and noise got people killed. What she found was not a spy. It was, in the end, a contractor who had worked 3 of the 4 failed operations in a support capacity, who had maintained a relationship with a foreign liaison contact that extended well beyond the professional. Not ideology, not money. Familiarity, mostly, and a gradual erosion of boundaries that had taken 4 years to reach the point where information traveled faster than it should. The contractor was removed from the program in late June of 1987. No charges were filed. The formal record noted a contract conclusion for administrative reasons. One of the 4 failed operations was retroactively reconstructed using the original objective. It succeeded in September of 1987, 11 months after its original failure. Ashford ran into Crane once more, in January of 1989, the Pentagon, a hallway near the E-Ring. He was there for a budget review. She was there for something she did not specify. She was carrying the same brown leather satchel, worn a little further at the corners than before. He asked how she was. She said she was well. He asked if she was still working the same assignment. She said she had moved to a different desk. He did not ask which one. They walked in the same direction for about 40 feet before their paths diverged. He turned left toward the conference room. She continued straight. He never saw her again after that. Margaret Elspeth Crane retired in 1997 after 29 years with the organization. She went back to Stafford County, Virginia, not the family farm, which had been sold in 1981 after her father's death, but a smaller piece of land 6 miles east, 18 acres, no livestock, a garden that her neighbors said was the most precisely organized garden in the county. She did not write a memoir. She did not speak to journalists. She did not attend any of the reunions organized by the agencies that processed her clearance, partly because those reunions did not exist, and partly because the clearance itself remained active for 6 years after her retirement, which meant she remained bound by disclosure agreements that could not be waived by ordinary administrative closure. The Omega clearance designation was formally retired as a classification tier in 2004, replaced by a restructured framework introduced after the intelligence reorganization of that year. The records associated with it were transferred to archival storage in a facility in Northern Virginia. Crane would have been aware of this. She had always paid attention to those kinds of details. Ashford retired from the Navy in 1994. He went back to Pensacola, where he had done his initial training in 1967, and took up commercial fishing on a 34-foot boat he bought used from a man in Destin who had run charters for 20 years. He worked the Gulf for 6 years before his back made it impractical. He talked about his career occasionally, in the way that people who have signed certain kinds of documents talk about it, in general terms, with accurate emotional texture and omitted specifics. He talked about the operations. He talked about the men. He talked about the long stretches in the briefing room, and the particular fatigue of planning actions whose outcomes you would learn about only afterward and in pieces. He did not talk about the Tuesday morning in March of 1987, or about the woman who had walked through his door without permission and sat down without asking. Not because he was required not to, because he did not think it was his story to tell. The Thursday operation, the one with the adjusted coordinates and the shifted radio window, landed clean. All personnel returned to the staging area within the scheduled window. The asset contact was made on schedule. The objective was reached. It was not a remarkable operation by the standards of that work. It was not written up in any official history. The men who ran it knew it had gone well. They did not know why it had gone well, specifically in the way it had not gone well 4 times before. They attributed it to better planning and to luck, in roughly equal measure, which is the way people who do dangerous things tend to attribute success when the full picture is not available to them. The full picture was in a file in a facility in Northern Virginia, and in the memory of one retired analyst living in Stafford County, Virginia, tending a garden that her neighbors said was the most precisely organized garden in the county. She had planted it in 1998, maintained it every year since. Still working, still precise, still there.